On March 12, 1981, at approximately 8:47 p.m., a man walked into the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., carrying a briefcase that would dismantle his family. His name was Richard Coleman. He was 44 years old, and inside that briefcase were photographs of classified documents, coded letters written in Russian, and a list of names in his wife's handwriting. By the time he left that building 3 hours later, his wife would be under federal investigation for espionage, and his 3 children would become the subjects of one of the most elaborate cover stories in Cold War history. The Colemans lived in Arlington, Virginia, a 20-minute commute from downtown Washington. They lived in a 2-story colonial, in a neighborhood where families knew each other's names and kids played in the street until the streetlights came on. Richard worked as a mid-level analyst at the Department of Commerce, a position he'd held since 1973. Margaret also worked at Commerce, 3 days a week as an administrative assistant in the Office of Trade Policy, a position she'd scaled back from full-time after their first child was born in 1968. On her non-work days, Tuesday and Thursday, she taught piano from their home, scheduling students throughout the afternoon, while their 3 children, Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah, were at school. According to neighbors interviewed years later, they seemed like any other family navigating the routines of suburban life in the early Reagan era, a dual-income household, making it work through careful coordination of schedules and responsibilities. But on January 28, 1981, that perception began to crack. Richard came home from work early that day, around 2:30 in the afternoon, with what he later described as flu symptoms. Margaret had been upstairs, and when she heard his car in the driveway, she came down quickly, too quickly, according to Richard's later testimony, with a flushed face and an unusual nervousness. He didn't think much of it at the time, went to lie down in the guest room, and probably would have forgotten the incident entirely except for what he found the next morning. In their bedroom closet, near the back wall, there was a floorboard that had never quite sat flush with the others. Richard had been meaning to fix it for months. On the morning of January 29th, he noticed that the floorboard was sticking out more than usual, and when he pried the board up, he found a metal box approximately 8 inches by 6 inches, and inside that box was evidence that his wife was working for the Soviets. The contents were methodically documented in Richard's later statements to federal investigators. There were 23 photographs of what appeared to be official documents, taken in low light with a 35mm camera. Some were documents he recognized from his own work, various trade analysis reports and policy assessments. Others appeared to be from different offices within Commerce, documents Margaret would have had access to through her administrative role, memoranda and briefing papers that crossed her desk for filing or distribution. There were 4 letters written in coded Russian, later translated and found to contain instructions about dead drops and communication protocols. There were receipts from a photo development shop in Georgetown, dated between May 1980 and January 1981. And there was a notebook, roughly 3 by 5 inches, filled with columns of numbers and abbreviations that cryptographers would later identify as a basic substitution code. Richard didn't confront his wife. Instead, he spent the next 6 weeks conducting what amounted to a personal surveillance operation. The methodical nature of his investigation, later detailed in his formal statement to federal agents, reveals a man who understood that he needed irrefutable evidence before he could take the devastating step of reporting his own wife to authorities. The first thing Richard did was photograph every item in the metal box. He used his own 35mm camera, a Canon AE-1 he normally used for family photos, and he shot 2 rolls of film making sure to capture every page, every notation, every detail that might prove relevant. He took the film to a different photo development shop than the one Margaret had been using, a place in Silver Spring where he paid cash and gave a false name. When he picked up the prints 3 days later, he stored them in his office at the Commerce Department, in a locked drawer where Margaret would not be able to look. Then he began checking the box regularly, establishing a pattern that would allow him to document changes without tipping Margaret off to his discovery. According to his later testimony, he checked the box on February 3rd, 7th, 11th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and March the 2nd. Each time, he noted whether anything had changed, whether new items had appeared or old items had been removed. On February 7th, 3 new photographs appeared, documents that looked like internal Commerce Department memos regarding grain export policies to Eastern Europe. One was a report Richard himself had worked on, a document he'd brought home to review over the weekend 2 weeks earlier. The realization that Margaret had been photographing materials from his own briefcase, materials he'd left sitting on his home office desk, made him physically ill. On February 19th, the notebook contained 2 new pages of coded entries. On March 2nd, one of the original letters was missing, replaced by a new one with different handwriting. The documentation was meticulous. Richard created a log, written in a small notebook he kept in his car, noting dates, times, and observations. He recorded when Margaret left the house and when she returned. He noted patterns in her behavior, small tells that he'd never paid attention to before, but that now seemed glaringly obvious. She always checked the mailbox before he got home from work, standing by the street for a moment longer than necessary, as if scanning for something. She made frequent phone calls from the kitchen phone, brief conversations that ended abruptly if he entered the room. She had developed a habit of running errands on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, her non-work days, always between 7:15 and 8:45 p.m., always claiming she was going to the grocery store or the pharmacy or to visit her friend Patricia. But when Richard began following her, what he discovered was that these errands rarely involved the destination she claimed. On February the 2nd, a Tuesday, Margaret left the house at 7:23 p.m. Richard waited 3 minutes, then followed in his car, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice his headlights. She drove not to the grocery store, but to Potomac Park, a location approximately 4 miles from their home. She parked near the entrance, walked to a specific bench overlooking the water, and sat there for exactly 20 minutes. She didn't appear to be meeting anyone. She simply sat, sometimes looking at a book, sometimes just staring at the water. At 8:02 p.m., she stood up, walked back to her car, and drove to a 7-Eleven where she purchased milk and bread, establishing what Richard would later recognize as an alibi for her absence. He documented the same pattern on multiple times throughout February. Always a Tuesday or Thursday evening, always the same park, always the same bench, always exactly 20 minutes. Richard began arriving at the park before Margaret, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. He watched her closely, looking for signs of contact with another person, but he never saw her speak to anyone or exchange anything with anyone. What he did notice, however, was that she always sat on the same bench, a green-painted bench with a dedication plaque, and he noticed that she always placed her purse on the left side of the bench, never in her lap, never on the right side. On February 26th, Richard arrived at the park 2 hours before Margaret's usual time and positioned himself approximately 50 yards away with a pair of binoculars he'd borrowed from a colleague at work, claiming he was interested in bird watching. At 7:04 p.m., a man approached the bench where Margaret would later sit. He was approximately 45 years old, wearing a dark coat and a hat, and he sat on the bench for less than 3 minutes. During that time, he appeared to read a newspaper. Then he folded the newspaper, placed it on the bench, and walked away. The newspaper remained on the bench for approximately 10 minutes before another person, a jogger who appeared to be exercising, sat down briefly, picked up the newspaper, and continued jogging. When Margaret arrived at 7:27 p.m., the bench was empty. She sat down, placed her purse on the left side as always, and remained there for 20 minutes. When she left, the purse appeared slightly less full than when she'd arrived, though Richard couldn't be certain from his vantage point. What he could be certain of was that he'd just witnessed what appeared to be a classic dead-drop operation, the kind of intelligence exchange he'd been briefed about during his security clearances at the Commerce Department. Richard's investigation expanded beyond surveillance. He began paying attention to Margaret's daily routines at home, looking for other signs of deception he might have missed. He noticed that she often stayed up later than him, claiming she wanted to finish a book or prepare lessons for the next day's students. On the night of March 3rd, Richard pretended to fall asleep on the couch while watching television, and he watched through half-closed eyes as Margaret came downstairs at 11:47 p.m., checked to make sure he was sleeping, then went to the kitchen. He heard the sound of the basement door opening and closing. After she went back upstairs, he waited 15 minutes, then went down to the basement himself. The basement was unfinished, used primarily for storage and the washer and dryer. Richard searched systematically, moving boxes, checking behind the water heater, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Behind a stack of old paint cans in the far corner, he found a small canvas bag, the kind that might be used for gym clothes. Inside were items that made his hands shake as he examined them by flashlight. A second set of identification documents with Margaret's photo, but a different name, Elaine Warner, with an address in Baltimore. A road map of the greater Washington area with several locations marked in pencil. $500 in cash, in 20s and 10s, and a small pocket calendar with dates marked, dates that corresponded exactly with the Tuesday and Thursday evenings Margaret had been leaving the house. Richard photographed everything, returned the items to the bag exactly as he'd found them, and went back upstairs. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the living room in the dark, thinking about the woman he'd been married to for 16 years, wondering how much of their life together had been real and how much had been a carefully constructed cover. He thought about how they'd met in 1965, both young employees at Commerce, how he'd been drawn to her intelligence and her music. He wondered now if she'd targeted him deliberately, if their entire relationship had been engineered by her handlers, or if the recruitment had come later and she'd simply exploited an existing marriage. He thought about their wedding, about the birth of their children, about ordinary moments like grocery shopping and watching television, and arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash. He thought about all the times he'd left his briefcase in his home office, never suspecting that his wife was going through it after he fell asleep. He thought about whether any of it had meant to Margaret what it had meant to him, or whether he'd been nothing more than a useful prop in her double life, a man with the right security clearances and the wrong amount of trust. By March 10th, Richard had compiled what he believed was sufficient evidence to take to federal authorities. He had photographs of the contents of the metal box. He had his surveillance log documenting Margaret's movements. He had photographs of the items in the basement. He had dates and times and locations. What he didn't have, and what kept him awake at night, was any idea of how to protect Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah from the catastrophic consequences of what he was about to do. He spent hours in his car during lunch breaks, parked in anonymous lots around Washington, trying to work through the impossible mathematics of his situation. If he reported Margaret, she would be arrested and charged with espionage. The arrest would be public, the trial would be public, and his children would become known throughout their schools and their community as the kids whose mother was a Soviet spy. They would be questioned, investigated, possibly even suspected of having knowledge of their mother's activities. They would grow up under that shadow, marked by a crime they had no part in, judged for associations they'd never chosen. But if he didn't report Margaret, he became complicit in her espionage. He became, in effect, an accessory to her crimes. And the information she was passing to the Soviets, whatever damage it was doing to American interests, would continue because he'd chosen his family's reputation over his duty to his country. The decision he ultimately made was to do both, to report Margaret to the FBI and to construct an elaborate fiction that would protect his children from the truth. He would turn in his wife, but he would not allow his children to know why she'd been taken from them. The plan began forming in his mind during the first week of March, refined through sleepless nights and agonized consideration of every potential consequence. He researched cancer treatment protocols at the library, learning enough medical terminology to make the lie sound plausible. He identified a fictitious treatment facility, claiming it was in upstate New York, far enough away that visits would be impractical, but not so far that it seemed implausible. He prepared answers to the questions he knew Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah would ask about prognosis and side effects and how long their mother would be gone. On March 11th, Richard made the decision to go to the FBI the following evening. He spent that day at work in a fog, barely able to focus on his assigned tasks, aware that he was about to set in motion events that would irrevocably alter the course of his family's life. He came home that evening and had dinner with Margaret and the children. Ordinary Wednesday night dinner, spaghetti and garlic bread and salad, Jennifer talking about a test she'd taken at school, Michael excited about a science project involving potato batteries, Sarah asking if she could have a sleepover with her friend Amanda on Friday night. Margaret laughed at something Michael said, reached over to wipe sauce from Sarah's chin, looked at Richard and asked if he was feeling all right because he seemed quiet. Richard told her he was fine, just tired from work. And he sat there at that dinner table, knowing it was the last normal meal they would ever have as a family, knowing that within 24 hours everything would be different, knowing that his children would spend years, possibly decades, trying to make sense of what he was about to do. But he had made his choice, and on March 12, 1981, he walked into the J. Edgar Hoover building and began the process of destroying his life in order to save it. What Richard was grappling with during those 6 weeks, according to his later interviews with federal investigators, was not whether to report what he'd found, but how to do it without destroying his children. Jennifer was 13, Michael was 11, Sarah was 8. They had no idea their mother was living a double life, and Richard became increasingly focused on the question of how you tell 3 elementary and middle school students that their parent is a Soviet spy without traumatizing them permanently. The solution he arrived at, the one he would present to the FBI on March 12th, was to tell them their mother had cancer. Special Agent David Thornton, the lead investigator who took Richard's initial statement, later described the meeting in a declassified debriefing memo. Richard arrived at 8:47 p.m., waited 47 minutes before approaching the front desk, and then spent the next 3 hours laying out everything he'd discovered. Thornton's notes indicate that Richard was calm, methodical, and insistent on 2 points. First, that his wife needed to be arrested immediately, and second, that his children could not know the truth about why. The FBI had actually been investigating a suspected leak from the Commerce Department since late 1980. Documents related to international trade policy and strategic resource assessments had been showing up in Soviet intelligence reports, indicating someone with access was passing information to Moscow. They hadn't identified the source. Richard's evidence gave them everything they needed: a name, a method, a timeline that stretched back to at least 1977, based on the earliest dates in the recovered materials. What made the case particularly damaging, Thornton noted in his report, was that Margaret had access to documents through 2 channels: her own administrative position, which gave her legitimate access to a wide range of inter-office communications and policy papers, and her husband's work materials, which he occasionally brought home and left unsecured in his home office. She had exploited both her professional role and her marriage to maximize the intelligence she could provide to her handlers. But Richard's request about his children created what Thornton later called an unusual ethical and operational dilemma. The Bureau would typically have no involvement in how a suspect's family was informed about an arrest, but Richard was asking for active cooperation in maintaining a false narrative. He wanted to tell his children their mother had been diagnosed with cancer, that she needed to go away for treatment, that she might not survive. He wanted the FBI to facilitate a goodbye visit framed as a hospital visit. He wanted Margaret to be arrested quietly, with no media presence, no public filing of charges, until the story about her illness was firmly established with the children. The request went up the chain of command. According to declassified memos, there was significant debate within the FBI about whether cooperating with such a deception was appropriate or even legal. But ultimately, the decision was made to accommodate Richard's request, partly out of sympathy for the children, partly because a quiet arrest served the Bureau's interests in terms of not alerting other potential Soviet assets who might be connected to Margaret's network. Margaret Coleman was arrested at 6:47 a.m. on March 14, 1981, a Saturday morning. Federal agents executed an arrest warrant based on a sealed criminal complaint filed the previous evening. 2 agents entered the house through the front door that Richard had left unlocked and took her into custody in the kitchen while she was making coffee. According to the arrest report, she did not resist, did not ask to speak to a lawyer, simply looked at Richard and said, "You found it." The children were still asleep upstairs. Richard gathered Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah in the living room that afternoon and told them their mother was sick. He used the word cancer, said it was serious, said she needed to go to a specialized treatment facility in another state. According to Jennifer's later recollection, her father was very specific about certain details: the type of cancer, the treatment protocol, the reasons they couldn't visit right away. He showed them medical pamphlets he'd obtained from the library. He explained that their mother wanted to protect them from seeing her while she was going through difficult treatments. The children believed him because why wouldn't they? Their father was not a man given to dramatic statements or emotional manipulation. If he said their mother was sick, then their mother was sick. 2 days later, on March 16th, Margaret was allowed a supervised visit with her children at a secure federal facility in Northern Virginia. The children were told they were being taken to see their mother at the hospital. They walked into a room with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting, and Margaret was already there, and according to the supervising agent's report, she held each child for an extended period and told them to be strong and to help their father and to remember that she loved them. The visit lasted 30 minutes. It was the last time Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah would see their mother for 14 years. Margaret Coleman's guilty plea proceedings began on August 3, 1981, in federal court. Due to the classified nature of the evidence, the proceedings were handled under the Classified Information Procedures Act, with portions sealed and limited public access. She pleaded guilty to 3 counts: conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized possession and transmission of national defense information, and acting as an agent of a foreign government without notifying the Attorney General. The prosecution's case, detailed in court documents, established that Margaret had been recruited in 1974 by a woman named Elena Rostova, who presented herself as a fellow piano teacher but was actually a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. The recruitment had been gradual. Initial requests were for basic information, publicly available documents, assessments of Commerce Department personnel that seemed like innocent gossip. By 1977, according to Margaret's own testimony, she was photographing classified documents 2 or 3 times a month, taking advantage of her administrative access to copy materials that crossed her desk and supplementing those with documents from Richard's briefcase when he brought work home. She would wait until late at night, after Richard was asleep, then photograph whatever was available using a small camera Eleanor had provided. She was never paid in cash, she stated, but her children's piano lessons were subsidized, her husband's car was mysteriously repaired after a breakdown, small benefits that appeared coincidental but were actually calculated compensation. When asked by the judge why she had done it, Margaret's response, preserved in court transcripts, was brief. She said she had believed initially that she was contributing to peace and mutual understanding between nations. She said that by the time she understood she was being used for espionage rather than diplomacy, she had been told explicitly that refusing to continue would result in harm to her family. She said she had been afraid, and that fear had kept her complicit for years. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison. She was transferred to a federal women's correctional facility within a week. Back in Arlington, Richard Coleman was executing the second phase of his plan, which was to maintain the fiction that Margaret was alive and receiving treatment indefinitely. He told neighbors she was at a long-term care facility that didn't allow visitors due to her compromised immune system. He told the children's teachers that their mother was undergoing experimental treatment and that they should be patient with any behavioral changes in the kids. He kept Margaret's piano in the living room. He framed photographs of her throughout the house. He spoke about her in present tense, as if she might return at any moment once the treatments were successful. The children adjusted the way children do, which is to say, imperfectly, but with the resilience that comes from not having any other choice. Jennifer threw herself into her studies, became the student council president, got straight A's through high school. Michael developed an obsession with taking things apart and putting them back together. Radios, bicycles, eventually computers. Sarah, the youngest, became quieter, more withdrawn, the kind of child teachers describe as seeming older than her years. Richard wrote to Margaret occasionally, brief updates about the children's progress that were carefully devoid of any personal emotion. Margaret wrote back monthly, letters that arrived in plain envelopes with an institutional postmark, and Richard locked them in a drawer in his study. He told himself he was saving them for when the children were older, when they could understand, but months turned into years, and he never found the right moment to explain that the story about their mother's illness had been a complete fabrication. The lie might have continued indefinitely, except that in 1987, Jennifer Coleman, by then a freshman at the University of Virginia, started doing math that didn't add up. Her mother had supposedly been diagnosed in early 1981. It was now 1987. 6 years was an extraordinarily long time to be in treatment for cancer without either recovering or dying. And Jennifer had majored in biology partly because she wanted to understand her mother's illness. And what she was understanding from her coursework was that the timeline her father had given her didn't make medical sense. She called Richard from her dorm room on April 22, 1987, according to phone records later reviewed during a family therapy session, and she asked him directly when their mother had actually died, because that was the only explanation that made sense to her, that Margaret had died years ago and Richard had been unable to tell them. Richard later said that hearing his daughter ask that question, hearing the logic she'd used to arrive at it, made him realize that the lie had reached its natural endpoint. He told her the truth over the phone. He told her about the arrest, about the espionage charges, about the 25-year federal sentence. He told her that her mother was alive and in prison in Georgia, and had been there for 6 years. Jennifer's response, according to Richard's later account, was silence. Several minutes of complete silence. Then she said, "I need to think about this," and hung up. She called Michael 3 days later. Michael was 17, a senior in high school, and according to his own later description, his response to learning that his entire childhood had been predicated on a lie was cold fury. He wanted specifics, dates, documentation. He wanted to know exactly what his mother had done, exactly why his father had lied, exactly how many other people had been complicit in maintaining the deception. He confronted Richard in person, and their argument, according to neighbors, was loud enough to be heard through the walls. Sarah was 14 when Jennifer and Michael sat her down and told her the truth. Her response was to cry quietly for approximately 2 hours and then to stop speaking to Richard beyond what was absolutely necessary for basic household communication. What followed was what family therapist Dr. Patricia Morrison, who began working with the Colemans in 1988, later described as a textbook case of trust dissolution. Jennifer came home from college only for mandatory holidays and maintained emotional distance from Richard during those visits. Michael stopped speaking to his father entirely for 11 months, communicating only through written notes about logistics. Sarah developed what Morrison identified as complex grief symptoms, mourning not just the mother she'd lost, but the father she felt she'd never actually known. The central question all 3 children asked, in various forms, was why Richard had chosen to lie. Why had he assumed they couldn't handle the truth? Why had he denied them the opportunity to know their mother as she actually was, to make their own decisions about how to process what she had done? Why had he taken that agency away from them for 6 years? Richard's answers, documented in therapy sessions, centered on protection. He had wanted to shield them from stigma, from the social consequences of being known as children of a Soviet spy. He had wanted to preserve their memory of their mother as someone who loved them, rather than as someone who had betrayed their country. He had believed genuinely that the truth would damage them more than the lie. But what became clear through those therapy sessions was that the lie itself had done extensive damage. The children hadn't just lost their mother, they'd lost their ability to trust their father's account of reality. They'd spent their formative years grieving a false narrative while the truth was being kept from them, and that betrayal of trust proved more difficult to recover from than the original betrayal of Margaret's espionage might have been. In June 1995, Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah drove to a federal correctional facility and visited their mother in prison for the first time. Margaret was 62 years old, 14 years into her sentence, and according to the prison visitation log, the meeting lasted 4 hours, the maximum allowed for family visits. What was discussed during those 4 hours comes primarily from the children's later accounts, since prison visits are not recorded unless specifically authorized for investigative purposes. Margaret explained, as best she could, how she had been recruited. She described Elena Rostova, the woman who had befriended her at a piano teachers' conference in 1974, who had gradually and skillfully manipulated her into increasingly compromising situations until she was too entangled to extract herself. She said she had tried to stop, multiple times, but had been told explicitly that her family would be harmed if she ceased cooperation. The three Coleman children began visiting regularly after that first meeting. Michael drove up from North Carolina, where he'd moved for an engineering job. Jennifer came from Washington, D.C., where she'd started working in public policy. Sarah visited during breaks from graduate school in Virginia, where she was studying clinical psychology. They built something that resembled a relationship with their mother, though it was a relationship conducted in 30-minute increments in a prison visiting room, and it bore little resemblance to the relationship they might have had if circumstances had been different. Richard Coleman never visited Margaret in prison. She wrote to him occasionally, brief letters that expressed gratitude for how he had raised their children, that acknowledged the impossible situation he had been placed in. He kept the letters, but did not respond. According to his own later statements, he believed he had done what he needed to do to protect his children. And while he could acknowledge intellectually that the lie had caused its own harm, he could not bring himself to regret the choice he had made in 1981. Margaret Coleman was released from federal prison on November 8, 2006, after serving 22 years of her sentence, reduced for good behavior and cooperation with counterintelligence debriefings. She moved to a small apartment in Atlanta, found work as a clerk in a music store, and began the difficult process of building a life as a 63-year-old woman who had last been free in 1981. Richard Coleman died on June 15, 2010, at age 73, from a heart attack while working in his garden. Jennifer, Michael, and Sarah were going through his belongings when they found the locked drawer in his study, and inside were approximately 200 letters from Margaret, letters he had saved but never shared with them. Reading through them, they found updates about their mother's life in prison, reflections on her choices, expressions of remorse, and questions about their lives. The story of Richard and Margaret Coleman is not a simple narrative about right and wrong. It is a story about the complex calculations people make when faced with impossible choices, about how love and fear can motivate the same actions, about how the consequences of those actions can ripple forward through generations in ways no one could have predicted. Richard Coleman turned his wife into the FBI because he believed it was his duty, and then he lied to his children for 6 years because he believed it was his responsibility. And both of those choices were simultaneously acts of integrity and acts of betrayal, depending on which angle you view them from.